Welcome to the Albany Book Festival online, presented by the New York State Writers Institute at the University of Albany. You can learn more about the festival and find direct links to independent booksellers at our festival webpage, albanybookfestival.com. Follow us on social media and hear from more videos from the Writers Institute.
Welcome to this year's Albany Book Festival at the State University of New York at Albany. I'm Mark Koplik, Assistant Director of the New York State Writers Institute. We're excited to be here today with David Treuer and Sierra Crane Murdoch. David Treuer is the author of The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, Native America from 1890 to the present, and a finalist for the 2019 National Book Award. It refutes the widespread notion that Native American civilization effectively died in the 19th century and presents an inspiring history of cultural vitality, variety, resilience, and reinvention up through to the present moment. An Ojibwe Indian who grew up on the Leech Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota, Treuer attended Princeton where he studied creative writing with former UAlbany faculty member, the late Toni Morrison. An acclaimed novelist, he has a PhD in anthropology and is a professor of English at USC in Los Angeles. Sierra Crane Murdoch is an investigative journalist who grew up here in New York's capital region. She's the author of Yellowbird, Oil, Murder, and a Woman's Search for Justice in Indian Country, a true crime story set on an Indian reservation during the recent out-of-control oil boom in North Dakota. It was named one of the most anticipated books of 2020 by the Chicago Tribune, BuzzFeed, Newsweek, and other publications. The book follows an amateur investigation conducted by Lissa Yellowbird, an Arikara Indian woman who sets out to solve the murder of a white oil worker. At the same time, the book explores Lissa's own family history, a history of hardship, trauma, achievement, and extraordinary resilience. You can find out a lot more about both books and both authors here on this website. You can also purchase the books from an independent bookseller via a link on this page. Sierra and David, thank you so much for being here at the online Albany Book Festival.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, thank you.
So many of us have grown accustomed to thinking about Native Americans in terms of otherness, as though they're a foreign people, entirely separate and apart. In both of your books, however, Native American experience is presented as a fully integral part of modern American history. Is it important for all Americans to come to see Native American experience as part of their own American experience and cultural heritage?
Yes.
Yes.
But I mean, if I can talk about Sierra's book just a little bit, one of the things that I found so compelling about the story and about the incredibly complicated story that I could never tell. I'm not an investigative journalist, and you really brought those chops to bear on that thing. But
Thank you.
You know, you sort of invert the sort of the traditional idea about reservations as places where bad things happen, as places outside of the you know, as little islands of difference in an American ocean. And it's, you know, this Native woman who's investigating on her own the disappearance and death of a white oil fields worker, not the other way around. It's not a white savior story, and I love that it's not that, and it's actually inverted. But I think Sierra's book really shows, you know, answers your question, Mark. I mean, there's this tendency to think of Native lives as necessarily in the past, and if we are alive, it's only a sort of, it's kind of afterlife, spent on dusty reservations where nothing ever happens. But if you read Sierra's book, you recognize that if you want to really see how power in America works and its destructiveness in some ways, and it's sort of the ill use of it in many ways too, you know, go to a Native community and you can see an anatomy of this country, not just of a tribe, not just of a reservation, but America's portrait comes clear when you know and understand Native American history.
Yeah, I thank you for those kinds of words about the book. Similarly, actually, when I read your book a year and a half ago, I had this experience of thinking, like, I've been covering as a journalist Native American communities for almost 10 years now. Not exclusively, but it has been. Like, I spent a lot of time on reservations. I spent a lot of time on the margins of Native communities, writing about the interactions of non-Native and Native communities when it comes to energy extraction, when it comes to all sorts of kinds of issues. And I think reading your book, I was like, how has all of this not been collected in a book before? Like, I feel like this is everything that I've had to teach myself or learn through interviews, through going to these places, through reading other books and kind of grabbing piecemeal from them. And to see it all in one work was like revelatory for me. And also drove home the fact that when I am normally writing about these things, I'm constantly conscious of the fact that very few people in our country interact with the communities that I do on a regular basis, and that have become fundamental to my life and my understanding of America. And so, yeah, I think one of the frustrations I felt as a journalist is that a lot of the ways that I read, a lot of the stories I've read about Native American communities is often like, here's this community, like bad things happen to them, and we're kind of like peering in from the outside almost into this like petri dish of like, okay, what's happening now? And instead of understanding communities in the way that I came to understand Fort Berthold Indian Reservation in North Dakota, which was as a reservation, a tribal community that is like interacting at a high level with our country, producing a significant amount of the oil in our country. And also, like you said, David, is a microcosm of America in the sense that the politics of America are playing out in a very clear way on this reservation, just watching the way that outside interests are trying to gain access to the reservation still. It's not like bad things happened in the past and now we're just seeing what's coming of it. It's that these interactions are still happening between Native and non-Native communities in these places, and they're affecting our lives in ways that we're not realizing. And so, yeah, that was what I wanted to show through this book.
Yeah, I mean, circling back again to the question again, Mark, like, America's deeply invested and always has been in the idea of like, what distinguishes this country from all others is that we have Indians. We had a frontier, we sort of manifested our destiny, right? Which meant sort of a constant sort of westward push, the expulsion of Native people, the decimation, So America's invested in this idea that that Natives were here, that we're all gone, that might be sad, that might just be the way life is, that the few, in people's imagination, that the few of us that remain are living, like shitty lives in the middle of nowhere. And isn't that sad? And once in a while, the national media will bear down on us, mostly to take its own temperature. Like, how are we as, how's our moral temperature? Let's go check on how badly the Indians are doing. Fact is, there are over 5 million Native people in the United States today. There are as many Native people as there are Jewish people in the United States. There are more Native people than there are people of who are Muslim in the United States. But you wouldn't think that from the news, And America has, on the contrary, not just been sort of imagining us and then doing us in for the past few hundred years, but we've been bound up in the American project since the beginning. I mean, America's first revolutionary act was to dump tea in Boston Harbor. They did so dressed as Mohawk Indians. And they did that dressed as Mohawk Indians because one of the reasons they went the war with the British Crown was over the question of who got to colonize lands to the west of the 13 colonies, the British or the colonists, who got to exploit those resources. And since then, and the first test of states' rights versus federal power was not over the question of slavery, it was over the question of the removal of the 5 civilized tribes from the American Southeast. You know, more recently, the Supreme Court has heard more cases about federal Indian law between like 65 to 95 than any other genre of law, more than immigration, more than reproductive rights, more than banking, more than capital punishment. You know, so America is a country that has been defined from the beginning in relation to Native people, and that's ongoing. With like Sierra's story about oil extraction, with the story of the Dakota Access Pipeline protest, which was framed as cowboys versus Indians or as white men getting Indians down. It's a much bigger question than that. Native people at Standing Rock were standing up to, you know, Dakota Access Pipeline and posing the question that, you know, of what matters more, corporate interest or the common good? And that is a bigger question that concerns all American people, not just Native people at Standing Rock, but it was Native people who are bringing that question to the front at that protest. So do people need to know Native history? Like, well, yes, if you want to know American history, yes, you have to know this stuff. You can't understand this country without thinking about Native people intelligently and informatively.
So here at UAlbany, as on many campuses, we've been wrestling with issues of cultural appropriation. One of our dormitory complexes is named Indian Quad, and it's made up of buildings that are named for the peoples of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Tuscarora, the Seneca, et cetera, and other tribes associated with upstate New York. There's a great deal of discomfort on campus with the name Indian Quad, and a great deal of confusion, I would say, and the appropriation of these various tribal names. What's your feeling about all of this?
Well, I don't need to tell you that the member tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy, you know, Onondaga, Mohawk, Tuscarora, Seneca, Oneida. Oh, shoot. I'm forgetting one. Anyway, they can speak for themselves very, very, very well. So I'm sure they're telling you what they feel. And so I don't need to speak for them, you know.
So both of your books affirm the value of reclaiming forgotten community history and family history. Is this important principally for the Native community, or is there a universal value in pursuing ancestral and family history that all young people should be thinking about?
I mean, I can talk to why ancestral history was important, you know, in the story that I told. I mean, like, for me, there were several reasons. One is that my book is about this woman, Lissa Yellowbird, who has survived like incredible violence in her life. And I spent a lot of time, violence that was inflicted on her and violence that she internalized and inflicted on herself. And I spent a lot of time with her wondering, like, how did Lissa survive? And not only how did she survive, but why is she thriving to the degree that she is? And the more time I spent with her, the more time I realized that the reason she survived and the reason why she is thriving was because of her family. She has this just incredibly large and supportive and very loving family that has been around her whole life, even during the times that she's really suffered. And so, you know, I immediately realized that the family part of this story was really important to her, and it was important to her family, and it was important to her reservation community that this is a family that is like highly involved in the local politics of the reservation, that's highly involved in the recovery community on the reservation. And so I yeah, I wanted to understand why Lissa survived. And so I went into that ancestral history. The other reason, though, is that I knew that I wasn't just tracing the lineage of a family in this book. I was also tracing the lineage of white violence. And so, like I was saying earlier, I knew that the suffering that her family had survived was related to this lineage. And I wanted to be able to put the oil boom in this context of white violence and understand that there has been this long history of outsiders, whether it's industry, whether it's individuals, whether it's governments, trying to gain access to reservation land by creating relationships with people within the tribe, creating economic and inequality and instability within the tribe, and that was playing out in the oil boom, but that had also played out over this long period of time. And I could even see that lineage through Lissa's own family as well. So yeah, I mean, I can say specifically that lineage is really important to Lissa's family, and it was really important to this story that I was telling. I don't feel like I can speak for Native families, but I can't even speak for Lissa's family. I just know from the time I spent with them that it's incredibly important to who they are today. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I can't speak for Native families generally either, but I can explain sort of in The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, my last book, and in my previous book of nonfiction, Res Life, which is more specifically focused on what reservations are and why they exist and what they mean and where they're going, because they're pretty unique to the United States. Canada has them too, but they're different. And that's about it. And there are different tribal areas in different countries around the world, but reservations as we know them are fairly unique to North America. But anyway, in both books, like starting with Res Life, I wanted to tell the story of reservations. And so I knew I had to talk to people. And this gets back to Sierra to me saying, like, you know, being an investigative journalist, like, is very difficult. I did not know how to do that. I was very uncomfortable talking to people. And so, but I also knew I had to, because history for me, and for both books, Res Life wasn't really a history book. It was just about what reservations are. And of course, there's a lot of history involved in that. But I needed to talk to people because I didn't see history as a set of events in the past, but as a force that is continually expressed through us in our lives and personalities. I wanted to show the effects of residential boarding schools on people now, something that might have happened a generation or two before. I wanted to sort of show how the effects of forced assimilation are still playing out, the effects of the Allotment Act, you know, which de-landed us to a large degree, are still playing out. So I had to talk to people. And when people talked, they talked about, you know, family and connection. But I also felt very strange doing that in both Res Life and Heartbeat without putting myself in. Mm-hmm. It didn't feel fair to ask people to risk themselves and talk to me and to expose themselves and really deep and personal things about themselves without risking something in return. It felt I could not do it that way. And so I put myself in, and it was really funny when I published Res Life. My publisher was like, yeah, this is great, you know, really good history. My editor, he's like, this is really great, but you need to take out the personal stuff. What? He said, yeah, I know we bought a history journalism book, not a memoir book, so you need to take out the personal stuff. And I said, I'm not doing it. And you can cancel the contract. I said, they can't risk something without me risking something. And besides, I'm like, whenever I pick up a book about Native life, I'm like, who is this person writing this book, and what is their involvement, and what gives them the right? People are going to have the same question for me, so I got to tell them who I am. It's just the way it's got to be. And it turned out that people kind of liked it, you know? So I had no such fights with Heartbeat, but I had a method. You know, it was a combination of historical research, immersion journalism and memoir. It's just sort of, I guess, the only way I know how to do things now. But family is big part of that, you know.
What about you, Sierra? Were there special challenges and a special sense of responsibility in telling a Native American story as a non-Native American yourself?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That was like my number one terror in writing this book. Yeah, I mean, I started writing this book, especially at a time when I think the question of like, who has the right to tell whose story was becoming a really big part of the national conversation, mainly in art, in fiction. But it all was also kind of creeping into journalism. And, you know, I thought that was a good thing, actually. You know, like, I think as journalists, I mean, it can be easy to hide behind this excuse that, like, you know, well, our craft, our job is to tell other people's stories, and that is true. And I do believe in, I believe in journalism. You know, I think it's important, and I don't believe in siloing ourselves, but I also believe in, especially in the process of writing this book, you know, I had to figure out, okay, like, what is my place in telling this story? And I do believe in journalists taking more time to really think about their role, and also taking the time to have transparent conversations with the people we're writing about that role in their lives. I mean, for a story like Yellowbird, like it wasn't like I was just coming in for a single, you know, article and then I was going to leave again. Like, this was me being intimately involved in Lissa's and her family's life for 5 years, and now having a relationship where we're sort of like fated to be connected for the rest of our lives. And I understood that, and I wanted to make sure she understood that. And she did. We had, you know, I was really grateful to her that she was open to having these like super transparent conversations all the way through. I can't say she was terribly interested in my process. Like, I would try to kind of explain things to her every now and then and be like, how much do you want to know? You know? And she'd be like, that's your thing, you know? But it did feel, you know, I write in the book, I don't know why she trusted me, and I don't think she knows either. But when I did ask her at one point, she said, well, you just kept coming back. And so I just let you I let you to come back. And so and it was over that period of time that we became incredibly close. And I became close with her in a way that I don't become close with a lot of sources, because it was just a different nature, this project. And I knew that in order to go as deeply as I wanted to go into her life, and as deeply as I think she wanted me to go, that we had to come to this place in our relationship where we did like love each other unconditionally, and where she felt that she could tell me pretty much anything, like the ugliest things that had happened in her life, and that I would take those things and place them in a context in her life that made them meaningful to her and to the people around her. And so, yeah, it was a very intimate process, and it required a deep, deep amount of trust. And I'm just really grateful that she let me be that person. I mean, she gets asked all the time, like, why did you let that white girl write that story about you? Like, you know, she has her own answers for it. But yeah, we got to a trusting place, and yeah. So
we end up going, Native people, we end up going a little crazy sometimes, because on one hand, you know, we're like, why doesn't anyone pay attention to this and pay attention to us and pay attention to our history? Mm-hmm. And then people pay attention. I'm like, well, who the hell are they to do this? You know, and it's a little, you know, this is kind of how we go nuts, mm-hmm. You know, but appropriation is a real yeah. issue. It's a real concern, you know, mm-hmm. And what I felt when I was reading your book is, and I don't always feel this way, is that you understood very clearly the difference between speaking of and speaking for.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I never got the feeling that you're speaking for people at MHA, you're speaking for Yellowbird's family, you're
Right.
speaking of them, you know.
Yeah.
And that's very different.
Yeah. And I made very specific choices. Like a sort of, you know, you said you wanted to put yourself in Heartbeat. I similarly decided I had to use the first person in Yellowbird, because what it allowed me to do is it gave me space especially toward the end of the book, when I was entering into Lissa's story, it gave me space to just let her talk versus like constantly paraphrasing her voice in a scene, because the book is so narratively driven. And then also, she's the kind of person that she's dynamic. Everyone in her life becomes a part of her life. Like they become a part of her story. She doesn't let you separate yourself from her. I could never just be the passive observer looking in on her life. I was in her life. I was participating in it. So yeah, I mean, I had to make deliberate narrative choices as well to try to express that.
Yeah. I mean, also, like, you know, back to your question, Mark, I mean, you know, appropriation is something that we all need to think about, you know, and everyone wants an answer, right? Like, this is how you don't do that, or this is how you avoid it. But every subject is different, you know, every community that you might be writing about or situated in is different. And every writer is different. So the rules are always, there is no playbook, you know. For me, it's a danger too. Like it's very possible for me to appropriate, even though I'm a native dude writing about native things. I'm not from the Southwest. I'm not from upstate New York. I'm not from the Pacific Northwest. I'm from Leech Lake Reservation. And I can't even speak for this place. You know, I can't speak for it, even though I'm from here. You know, and one thing, so it shaped my decisions, and it shaped them a little differently. So everyone I talked to for both Res Life initially and then for Heartbeat, these are, you know, 10 years of interviews. I kind of realized I only could do it one way. When I sit down with someone to talk to them, I said, here's what we're going to do. This is not how journalism usually goes, but this is what we're going to do. I'm going to record you. We're going to talk. We're going to talk a long time. It might be a few hours, it might be a few days. We might talk over months. This might go on for years. At a certain point, I'm just going to probably end up disappearing and going back to my regular life. And it might be years before I sit down to write out the book that I'm interviewing for. But when I write the book, and if you end up using the material I got from you, this is what we can do. This is what I will do. I'll take the chapter or the section in which you appear, and I will, that entire section, not just the quotes from you, but just you in context of this larger thing I'm saying. I'll send it to you and you get to read it first before anyone, before my wife, before my editor, before my agent. You see it first, and you can correct errors of fact, because I know I'll make mistakes. You can rephrase things you wished you'd said differently because you dropped too many F-bombs or because you got excited or whatever. And if you don't like how the assessments I make of you, if you do not like how, you know, what arguments or discussions that your testimony is being hitched to, you can tell me, I'm out. I don't want to do this anymore. And I will completely take you out of the book. It'll be as though I've never spoken to you, and there'll be no mention of you in the book at all. I said, because we've been sold down the river so many times. People have made of our lives whatever they've wanted for so long. I cannot bear to put myself in a position where I could sell you out. I couldn't handle it emotionally. So you have complete control, because we have had so little control for so long, especially in print, as Native people who are in print. That's the only way I know how to do this. No one's ever opted out. Plenty of people have rephrased things. And of course, errors of fact, that goes without saying. So many. But it's the only way that works for me. You know, it keeps me accountable, and it keeps me from being appropriative, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I did that with Lissa, David, and I was wondering, and with other members of her family, and I was wondering, it was the first time I'd done that was like showing the work, and it felt like the most vulnerable part of the whole process for me, right? Like showing back sort of how you've been interpreting people. And I was just curious what that process was like for you.
Yeah, it felt, a lot of times it's no problem.
Yeah.
But a couple times it really was. Like, I interviewed this Blackfeet dude for Heartbeat. And I make some assessments about him and his character. I say I think I talk about him as being one of the saddest men I've ever met. You know, I really liked him. I liked David a lot. And so I called up his nephew and I was like, hey, dude, I'm really nervous to share this with your uncle. Like, I really like him. I don't want him to be upset by how I characterize him. And he's like, well, what do you say? And I told him, he says, look, he's a native bear bronc and then saddle bronc riding Indian cowboy, poet, guitar player. I was like, He's like, they're the saddest people in the world. He's like, don't worry about it. And so I did show it to him. He's like, it's all good. You know, it's awesome. So, but of course, like, I definitely feel vulnerable. But I feel like that when I go to talk to people too, just, it stresses me out, you know, especially people I'm impressed by. I just interviewed this Vietnam vet from Mille Lacs Reservation that I know ceremonially, and socially, and then to sit down with him professionally, you know, the fact that he would talk to me at all just filled me with dread. Like, I don't want to let him down. And I love him. I respect him so much. And he also scares the shit out of me too. So the vulnerability is kind of woven throughout all of it. Like, upon meeting, while talking, afterwards, you know, at publication, it never ends, you know, but
We're coming up on time, but I'd like to squeeze in one more question if I can. The story we've been told about modern Native American history has been a story of powerlessness. You both show that story is wrong, and the story itself is disempowering. In this time of plague and social isolation and abuse of power, many students may have their own sense of powerlessness. How can they overcome that, and can they find inspiration in Native American political activism, in your view?
I don't know if they can find it in Native American activism necessarily. Our activists, like in our activist groups, are as fraught as any other. AIM was very powerful and very effective, the American Indian movement, and very misogynistic and very violent, especially toward women. So it's complicated, you know, but what helps me anyway is, like, I read in college and it stayed with me throughout. And this was really the thesis of my book, but it's also just sort of a life thesis too, I suppose, was that there's a quote from early on in Karl Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which I'm sure is on everyone's bedside table. And he says something to the effect of, all men make history, but they don't always make it from positions of advantage with tools of their choosing, but they make history nonetheless. And to me, that was instructive. We're used to thinking of Native people as powerless, but we have been agents in our own lives. We have been not always from a position of power, not always with good tools, but we have been making history nonetheless. We have been shaping our lives, not just buffeted by the whims of colonial power and then American power. And that is hugely important to remember. And it's obvious if you spend any time in a Native community that this is true. We have power. We have more power than we often imagine we have. And we exercise it as complicatedly as anybody else, poorly, sometimes well, sometimes for the greater good, sometimes for personal gain. You know, but we have it.
Yeah, I think that was really beautifully said. I mean, I don't I'm not one who likes to romanticize individuals or even movements. I think that can become really dangerous for reasons that David just explained. And what drew me to Lissa Yellowbird and what made me ask her if I could make this book about her was that she is someone who demonstrates incredible power and agency. And also is incredibly flawed at the same time and is very honest about that. And so I found it to be definitely reinvigorating to spend so much time inside the life of someone who is never glorifies herself, but who at the same time, and who is incredibly honest about her flaws. But at the same time, just like really could care less what you think of her. And will do, and has a very strong sense of what she believes justice is, and will pursue that to like pursue it until she has it. She's probably one of the most dogged people I've ever met in that sense. And so I think, spending time inside of her life and also seeing those elements within her family as well gave me incredible hope. And I'm not someone, again, who likes to romanticize, but I find a lot of strength in people who embody both kind of their flaws and their agency at the same time. So yeah.
The books are The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee and Yellowbird. They're available for purchase via a link on this website. In addition to this conversation, David Treuer and Sierra Crane Murdoch will be meeting virtually later this semester and answering questions in real time with University at Albany students who have read their books. To our online audience, thanks so much for visiting the Albany Book Festival. And please be sure to check out all of our online events. And to Sierra and David, it's been a pleasure spending time with you.
Thank you, Mark.
So
and thank you, Sierra.
This book festival is made possible with the support of the McGuire Family Endowment at the Writers Institute, the University at Albany Foundation, the Office of the President of UAlbany, the Peacock Family Foundation, the Capital District Library Council, Stuyvesant Plaza, Chet and Karen Opalka, Charles Toohey and Alice Green, Pernilla Dake, Elizabeth Ruthman, and Betsy Lopez. If you appreciate our programming and would like to support the Writers Institute, you can find out how at nyswritersinstitute.org.